Josh, can you walk us through how the US would sort of like fund this reserve? What are the acquisition methods? What are the pros and cons of the different ways of obtaining the Bitcoin?
So I think basically you would do this in one of three ways. So first of all, it could just be a line item on the budget. If it's a line item on the budget, it's the current budget at least. I guess this would entail issuing treasury bonds and using the proceeds to buy Bitcoin. An alternative to this would be, like I said before, the United States owns a lot of assets. So one of the things that you could do is actually just take some of the assets that you already own and sell some of them and to buy Bitcoin. This would kind of diversify the asset pool of the United States. And then the third thing is that the United States government already has Bitcoin in its possession that they have collected through law enforcement actions and things like that. So they could just not sell the Bitcoin like they have in the past. They could just hang on to the Bitcoin and sort of make that a sort of permanent component of their Bitcoin reserve. I think that there's costs and benefits to doing all of the above, right? I think that maybe the one that we need to think carefully about is that last one. So on the one hand, like if you're going to accumulate Bitcoin and you already have Bitcoin, then maybe it's kind of dumb to sell sell the Bitcoin out of your right hand and then buy it back with your left hand. But also you don't want to set the precedent that law enforcement actions are going to contribute to the strategic Bitcoin reserve, because this potentially creates bad incentives for law enforcement agencies. And so we have to be sort of careful about that. And so on the one hand, the fact that you already have some, if you wanted to take that and move that into the reserve, I think is perfectly fine. But I think also you want to make clear that you're not starting a precedent that you're going to always keep Bitcoin that are seized in law enforcement actions, because then that creates bad incentives for law enforcement.
Yeah, I've been hearing concern over that too. So appreciate you addressing that. All right, gonna go to Matt Pines here. So once we've got the Bitcoin, right? How are we gonna store it? How are we gonna secure it? What's the infrastructure got to look like for that?
Yes, and I'll kind of maybe bridge the two questions here. So, just by looking at history, right? So, the 1934 Gold Reserve Act established something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And it was initially funded, Section 10, essentially by about $2 billion of liquidity that was generated on the government's balance sheet as a result of sort of monetizing, raising the gold price, essentially, that it was marking to its books. And then it gave the Treasury Secretary, legal authority to use that exchange stabilization fund to purchase or sell gold or other, commodities, other sort of financial instruments in his or her discretion in order to meet the broad scale objectives of the exchange stabilization fund. And so, like, mechanically, right, you could look to the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, the exchange stabilization fund, as just a mechanism that's interpreted by the president to purchase Bitcoin and hold, right? And then if that's the mechanism, then the security and the control responsibility would be under the Secretary of the Treasurer, the Secretary of the Treasury, and his or her delegated officer to set up a program. Right, so this would be an official program of the U.S. government to make open market purchases of Bitcoin to hold on the government's balance sheet through like a legal mechanism, like the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and that would require a whole host of sort of custody and security policies be written and enforced, like the government does. What the government does well is write such things, and the government has large existing bodies of regulatory requirements that it imposes on itself for both cybersecurity regulation as well as sort of financial accountability, sort of auditing, that would all be applicable to such a reserve. And so I would expect there to be a requirement for regular audits and reports. You could even take advantage of the unique aspects of Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. You can do proof of reserves. You can audit essentially in an open and real-time fashion the location, the actual address that those Bitcoin are held within, and can then see and inspect any movement, at least on the blockchain. And from just a pure cybersecurity perspective, the U.S. government does have existing cybersecurity requirements on its federal agencies. I think we also have physical security requirements on our reserve assets, right? The Federal Reserve Bank of New York custodies, hundreds of billions of dollars of gold, not just for us, but for many nations around the world. And that obviously comes with intense physical security requirements. I think all would be necessary to construct 4 such essentially digital Fort Knox, which would have a physical instantiation, right? So I think it would be prudent to take advantage of the fact that you can do essentially multi-signature arrangements, essentially NFM, distribution of private keys. The national security agencies and other intelligence agencies are quite expert at securing very valuable pieces of information. So I think they should have a tasking to do an assessment of what the best sort of cybersecurity practices are, and then sort of geographically distribute. Would be a prudent measure. Sort of icing on the cake to move that multi-signature scheme. Again, that's maybe a bit sort of technical in the weeds. I think you'd want to have the government in many agencies kind of provide their expertise to the Secretary of the Treasury to design a security program that would also take advantage of the unique aspects of Bitcoin. It would be like a very valuable national asset. You'd want to protect it accordingly. And so, yeah, I think this is something that's perfectly within the wheelhouse and expertise of the federal government to do. Existing custodians, in Wall Street, have been able to, securely custody large amounts of Bitcoin. So I think we know how to do it. I don't think the security will be a sort of hindrance to considering the viability of the proposal.
Follow-up question here. A number of people sort of make suggestions that it makes sense to lock the Bitcoin, right? Or how do we sort of protect against a following administration who maybe is less friendly to Bitcoin? Do you have any thoughts on that? Is that something that's doable, feasible, or is that something that we would even want to do?
I'll give you my quick take. I think, again, this is more of a political question as opposed to a policy question of the structure of the reserve itself. In general, I think part of the arguments we've been making is that such a reserve would provide option value and increased strategic flexibility for the U.S. government. And there could be a trade-off. If you time lock these things, you could be eliminating some of that strategic flexibility. You could eliminate, while at the same time, it could serve as a very strong commitment mechanism and a signaling function that you can absolutely rely on the U.S. government not to sell it. And so I think those are sort of different implementations that would run potentially crosswise, right? And I don't know, maybe there's like a compromise where some subset is time locked for the future, but a sufficiently large subset is open for the government's discretion to pursue its objectives, right? Which is not to just pump the price of Bitcoin, but to reinforce confidence in its economic and monetary system and overall sort of financial and geopolitical position.
Yeah, if I could just add one thing in there too, which is so if the market starts to expect that every 4 or 8 years the U.S. government will sort of mechanistically engage in large-scale purchases and sales of Bitcoin, then prices will move sort of up or down in anticipation of those large purchases, and the government will basically be getting ripped off because in anticipation of a large sale, prices will fall. In anticipation of a large purchase, prices will rise. So essentially, that would be a situation where the government would be mechanistically buying Bitcoin when it's expensive and selling it when it's cheap. So that would be a very costly decision. I think if the government does decide to purchase Bitcoin, they would definitely want to do it with the idea of being committed for the very long term.